السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. طبتم وطابت أوقاتكم بكل خير أينما كنتم، وأهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه الندوة الافتراضية بعنوان الشهادات المصغرة المتتابعة من منظور سوق العمل. ويسعدني أنا زيد بن علي الرقيب تقديمها لكم نيابة عن المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني من الرياض عاصمة المملكة العربية السعودية. ستكون الترجمة الفورية متاحة باللغة العربية لهذه الجلسة. بإمكانكم الضغط على أيقونة الترجمة أسفل الشاشة. Greetings from the city of Riyadh, capital of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm Zaid Al-Raqib. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center, we welcome you all to this webinar on Stackable Micro-Credentials, an industry perspective. It is with great privilege that we welcome Professor Kevin Ashford-Rowe, Pro Vice Chancellor, Learning and Teaching at Queensland University of Technology, who will be the host of this session. We also welcome the distinguished panelists, Dr. Ashley Jones, SFIA accredited consultant and a member of the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency Register of Experts, and Ms. Margot Griffith, co-chair cross-sector micro-credential and community practice. We thank these distinguished speakers for joining us today. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to our host, Professor Ashford-Rowe.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Zaid. And I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge colleagues who are joining me to present and those colleagues who are joining us as participants to the session. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Margot, if she could share the screen with you. And what we'll do is tell you a little bit about what we're here to talk about today, which is in essence micro-credentials, particularly from a stackable perspective. And in particular, today, we're putting a focus on the industry dimension. Now, we have talked previously about micro-credentials from an educational perspective, and indeed, as you'll understand, micro-credentials are one of these emergent educational phenomenon that span both the educational perspective and the industry's perspective, and I think increasingly the social community perspective as well. And whilst we consider them from that broader range, today we're going to be very much focusing on them, our thoughts in terms of them as an industry phenomenon. And I might ask Margot to share our next slide, please. So the intention that we have here, I've just done a short introduction, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that nexus between education and industry. And I think what is an increasingly important requirement for there to be co-design, and that's co-design predominantly with industry in order to create value in micro-credentials, because what we have to understand is that as with all educational credentials, they are not necessarily in and of themselves of value. It's what goes into them. It's the rigor of the design, and it's the essence of the delivery. And particularly from an industry perspective, it's the co-design with industry that gives them that inherent value. Ashley is going to very kindly talk to us a little bit about her experience and her work in co-designing capability credentials in terms of an assessment framework, and she's going to provide us with some use case examples. I only met Ashley fairly recently myself, but what we'll find is that Ashley has a wealth of experience, and considering what an emergent conversation this is, Ashley's got considerable experience across a range of organizations and entities that she can bring to bear that will help us to not just understand and consider micro-credentials from that broader perspective, but also some of the challenges and some of the issues that you have to think about and resolve as you want to enact them in that industry context. And then Margot, again, who has considerable industry experience and cross-sector experience through Australia, and in fact, as with Ashley, internationally. Margot's going to talk to us a bit about how micro-credentials are framing or representing skills as a currency in our emergent new labour market. And if we think we're moving into beyond an industrial age and into an information age and very much a digital economy, I think it's important that we think about the ways in which we credential for that digital economy. And there will be consistent themes, I think, that we'll all unpack as we go through this, but one of them is going to be that that important merger between the educational rigor and the curriculum design and assessment rigor that goes into micro-credentials, but also their framing within technology contexts. And it's very difficult to, you have to be successful across both of those. And what we're hoping is, of course, that will be as much time as possible for us to have some questions and considerations and further discussion at the end of it. So I might go to the next slide, please, Margot. And for me, in terms of thinking about micro-credentials from an industry perspective, I think there's a bigger picture conversation in play, and it's something that, bearing in mind that I come very much at this from a university and think about this through the lens very much of higher education. I think there's an important conversation that's occurring more generally around the 3 to 4 year deliberately designed by experts, curated and delivered narrative of a traditional degree that takes you from, or takes a prospective student from first year undergraduate to 3rd or 4th year graduate, and it can be in very much an applied area like nursing or teaching. But it's a considered, deliberately designed, deliberately developed by experts pathway that, if you like, scaffolds you as a learner. And there is an importance for us in higher education to understand where and how micro-credentials, which are very often talking about the disaggregation of elements of those particular courses or units of those courses, where and how micro-credentials fit into that broader conversation, and whether or not how far we continue to have a role for this 3-4 year designed, curated degree versus this sense of creating almost a disaggregated smorgasbord of micro-credentials or smaller offerings that that a learner has to think about how they aggregate them themselves, how they stack them, and how they build them to enable them to get to where it is that they want to be in their career perspective. And of course, the reality, as is the case with all new developments and initiatives in education, it's not that we necessarily move from one to another, but the reality is we have to start thinking about how we accommodate both and how they work together. And I might go to the next slide, please, Margot. So again, this is very much my focus from my perspective of working in the field of higher education and working with colleagues across various education sectors predominantly. I think there are some key considerations that you need to have and think about up front if you're even thinking about micro-credentials. And one of the first of those key considerations for me is whether they are or are not offered for credit. And when I say credit here, I'm talking about credit in the very traditional sense of, do they enable you to have some form of credit in the form of points that you can take to an education provider and cash in against a further qualification. And presumably, if something is going to be stackable, somewhere in the process of achieving that micro-credential, I would imagine there needs to be some form of requirement that tells the person who is going to receive that micro-credential and stack it against the next micro-credential that you want to do, that you've achieved some kind of outcome to a certain standard that enables them to think about how they might be stacked progressively. That is, if they are stacked progressively. So I think there's a question about whether or not they're for credit. And if they are for credit, how is it assessed? what is the constructive alignment between the learning outcome that is being taught and the assessment that will determine that a student has achieved that learning outcome? Because however you break down learning, and whichever sector you're in, at some point for learning to be valid, there needs to be some form of expressed outcome of that learning. And if it's assessed, some mechanism whereby an expert is enabled to assure themselves that they've gained sufficient evidence to determine that the student, the learner, that the individual has achieved that expertise. And so if it's going to be assessed, then who designs the curriculum, the syllabus, the assessment, who develops it, who quality assures it? Because one of the concerns I've long had in micro-credentials is that if there aren't some form of frameworks to assure quality in place, you're essentially opening the door to a bit of a free-for-all. And if we want to attract learners and provide them with opportunities to gain skills, to gain experience, to gain knowledge, then there is a covenant in place, particularly if we're charging them for accessing those micro-credentials, that says that if we're charging you for this experience and to get this learning, then we need to be able to assure you that once you've committed, invested your time and effort and done this work, that you will have something that's meaningful at the end of it. And that also takes me then into who are the experts who are going to be signing off on these micro-credentials? Are they experts in the education field? Are they experts from industry? Or are they in fact both? Is it a combination of somebody who's providing curriculum quality assurance and rigor and therefore sign off, and then somebody who is a subject matter expert providing industry sign off, which is very similar to the way that we work in lots of our traditional courses? And then how and where will the credits be stored? Because if you think about the example of the scouting movement, where micro-credentials in the form of badges are awarded, well, they're very visible because they're sewn onto the sleeve of a jumper. So a scout wears the jumper to their scout meetings. People can see the micro-credentials that they've achieved. Well, I'm presuming that our micro-credentials and our badges, we want to be able to pass them around a bit more fluently and fluidly than just sewing them onto someone's sleeve, or indeed putting them into a paper portfolio that they have to pass around. So we have to think about where and how we digitally receive and store those, and how we enable them to be shared. And then if they are for credit, how is that credit received and awarded, whether it's part of demonstrating recognition of current competence in the workplace or a new competence, or it's back against an educational provider because you want to stack it up for further credit. And I might go to the next slide, please, Margot. And I think that even if they're not for credit, even if you've decided that at the lowest level, it's more about some kind of refresher, or providing some students, learners with some kind of access to something that's more introductory, for example, then what is their purpose from an employment perspective? And we need to think about this up front, because if we're offering ostensibly a product, a credit, a credential out into the workplace to potential learners, then the onus is on us to have thought about what is the skill gap that it's providing. How will the acquisition of this credential and the skills inherent or knowledge inherent in it, how will that help you advance your career? How will it help you get the next promotion, or how will it help you broaden what it is that you know? Either way, even if they're not for credit, then they still have to be credentialed somewhere. And that means you need a system and a mechanism to recognize and store that credential. You need somebody who's an expert somewhere, again, to be providing that quality assurance that gives that provides for the prospective learner the assurance that there is some rigor in what it is that they're undertaking. And then, of course, where and how is that quality assured? And if we're talking from an industry perspective, that probably means that somewhere along the way, that quality assurance, that expert sign-off probably needs to happen in both a educational setting and an industry setting. And I might go to the next slide, please, Margot. So at QUT, we have had fairly extensive experience from a number of years ago in MOOCs. And in many ways, MOOCs and the MOOC movement has offered signposts to the micro-credentialing conversation, and MOOCs offering free courses and the opportunity to gain access to free learning, which has been credentialed or non-credentialed. It's almost an early example of what's now starting to be more formalized in the form of micro-credentials, I'd say. We at QUT have worked through FutureLearn, with whom we're in within a contracting relationship. We're, of course, watching eagerly the news at the moment to see what may happen to FutureLearn in the next few weeks and months. But I do note as well that in your kingdom, you have FutureX, and through FutureX, you have access to a range of the different micro-credential providers. We've had the opportunity through FutureLearn to build a range of different sized credentials and different sized educational offerings that we've sought to use to take us from a freely available MOOC in a deliberate and designed and constructed way, theoretically, to where someone could progressively stack those qualifications up to commencing a master's degree and then go into a master's program. Of course, it's not without its challenges, because what we're offering, what we're considering, is it's far from the traditional way in which people understand their engagement with formal education. And there is also an interesting point along that MOOC to master continuum, as I've described it there, where you move from something being accessible to you for nothing, for free, to having to actually pay for it. And even if what you pay is a small amount, it's a different type of commercial relationship that you're engaging in. And I think we have to be very, very clear upfront that we understand how that impacts the engagement of potential learners. We've also, at QUT, created an award to non-award micro-credential framework that was a way of helping us to, from an institutional perspective, start to come up with some consistent nomenclature and some consistent definitions around what were the different types of awards in that non-award space that we provided. Universities traditionally provide certificates of attendance or certificates of attainment. There is very little consistency, even within institutions, as to whether or not what it is you need to achieve a certificate of attendance, which I think is predominantly attend. But we, of course, know from the literature that attending something doesn't necessarily mean that you're learning anything from it. And then a certificate of attainment, which also may, in some instances, be provided to you just because you attended. So what we've sought to do is to provide some consistency around the ways in which we use those terms, and think about consistency in terms of volumes of learning, whether an offering is assessed or not assessed, whether it bears credit or doesn't bear credit, and if it does bear credit, where does that credit go? Where is that credit stored? And if you look to cash it in at an institution in the late 2 years from when you've achieved it, what guarantees do you have that the institution will recognize that, yes, you did that credential, you successfully completed the assessment, you have 2 units of 2 points of credit that will count towards your degree and your qualification. And interestingly, and I think this will probably be touched upon a bit more, we have continued to work with FutureLearn and their sister organization, Online Education Services, on micro-credentials, which FutureLearn, being a UK organisation, they deliver to the European standard, and the European standard for a micro-credential, interestingly, is, I think it's 100 to 150 hours of learning, volume of learning. And that coincidentally, from an Australian perspective, situates a micro-credential as almost the same volume of learning as a unit of study that we would have at a university that you collect the units to construct your degree. I might go to the next slide, please, Margot. There's just 3 sources there. I believe that we will be sharing the slides, and I've put the hyperlinks to them, but those are 3 sources that seek to unpack some of that thinking around the purpose of qualifications and do micro-credentials matter, Lisa Wheelahan. And I would encourage you to listen to that, because it is very much from an industrial context, and it is an interesting debate and discussion. And then the Don Present blog that Margot shared with me, just talking about some of those challenges of stacking micro-credentials, and then the link to that European micro-credential framework. And I might go to the next slide again, please, Margot. So I'm getting near to the end of my part of this session, but one of the things I did want to flag in moving on is that in sharing the conversations with Margot and other colleagues in Queensland, in the state in Australia within which I work and operate, we suddenly came to realize that there were many of us across different fields of education who were actually all out there developing our own micro-credential award to non-award frameworks, because we were all struggling to grapple with how do we create some kind of consistency and how do we better manage these things internally. And we got to a point where we realized that certainly in Queensland, there were 3 or 4 universities, ourselves included. There was the major vocational education provider, which in Australia is a College of Training and Further Education at TAFE, TAFE Queensland, who were also in the same situation, and in fact a state high school, Beanie State High School, who had already done some advanced work on micro-credentials. So we sought to pull together, we created a space, a community of practice into which people who were interested and challenged and intrigued by the notion of micro-credentials could 3 or 4 times a year come into one place where we would facilitate a conversation, share some experiences, hopefully share some of the challenges, share resources, watch the conversation together as it unfolded. And what's been really interesting out of this community of practice has been born a number of cross-sectoral collaborations that have been very rigorous and educationally deep and meaningful ways, sought to think about from a very grounded perspective how we might take a particular micro-credential, develop it. I think the one that we used was digital literacy, and then work out how we managed to parse that through various sections of the education system and how it might also then be received and represented from an industry or from an industry perspective. And I might go to the next slide, please, Margot, which to my very great relief gives me the opportunity to hand over to our colleague, Dr. Jones. And Ashley, I'm happy to pass the baton and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thanks everyone. It's delightful to be here today. Look, following on from Kevin's excellent overview, I think you'll agree of the nexus between education and industry and the importance of co-design. I'd really like to start introducing how this has happened effectively over the last couple of years from my perspective, and the ways in which I do believe that capability frameworks underpinning micro-credentials can actually bridge the nexus between industry and education, particularly in the area of assessment that Kevin has mentioned so eloquently. So why capability frameworks? What is a capability? When we think about what industry requires, it's not just the skills and knowledge that are taught brilliantly in the higher education space or in the vet space, the training sector that Kevin mentioned. It's more a combination of what makes up an individual. So those cognitive attributes, and perhaps equally as important, those personal experiences that bring together. So what we're really trying to do is almost a unicorn experience, right? We're trying to holistically measure robustly and iteratively, but also allow for the individual to shine and to be able to be measured in some holistic way. So I'm going to posit that there's a number of frameworks out there that actually allow for measurement against those common sets of achievable criteria, so that we can rely on the holistic part of the individual, and so therefore provide what is really importantly a credit matrix for both lifelong learning, upskilling, reskilling, and all of the different elements that both industry, employers, and learners becoming employees want, both across early careerist entry, but also to remain relevant in 4.0, particularly within the digital environment. Thanks very much, Margot. So what I'm talking about is an outcome-based capabilities framework approach, which is a tool designed to provide a common language. And that's what we're really talking about, is that common language that Kevin mentioned within the community of practice that is very vibrant within Queensland and is actually really future focused, and actually is a great example of the ways in which both industry and educational institutions can come together. So it's an ability to be able to define those skills, knowledge and behaviours that I mentioned in order to measure agreed outcomes that cross both against job-related skills, capabilities and behaviours, and that aren't particularly siloed, that actually are cross-sectoral and can be utilised across industry. So, you know, if we're talking about problem solving, for example, being able to show problem-solving skills at various levels of mastery independent of the discipline-specific requirement means that we're able to pivot people and to be able to measure their capabilities. And so I mentioned that bridge, that innovative bridge that gives us the ability to be able to measure, and I do actually really mean measure, across education and professional development spectrums, to be able to train, particularly in the skill gaps that are developing globally. Thanks very much, Margot. So capability frameworks, explained why, and what's the importance. I've mentioned the common language, but it's also that ability to be both innovative and iterative, and to build against various different qualification frameworks, which the Australian qualification frameworks maps to the European, maps to the Indian, the New Zealand. What we see is a nexus that we are able to utilise in order to be able to ensure that we can build microcreds based on standards, whether they're international standards of accounting or qualifications frameworks, that gives us the ability to be able to build and stack in a way that hopefully in the future becomes a way for industry and higher education and the vet sector to be able to all work together in terms of providing pertinent skilling to be able to ensure that those either entering the workforce or already in the workforce can actually be continuously progressive in their lifelong learning. They're verifiable externally, and Margot's going to touch beautifully on that in the next part of this presentation, and that they can be validated to be able to show a problem-based application, because I'm talking evidentiary-based application of skills that are built through micro-credentialing efforts. Thank you, Margot. So if we want to build a framework to underpin our capability development, I've mentioned mapping to the qualifications frameworks and other international standards and frameworks. And the beauty of that is that you can actually put them across each other. And when I go to some of the use cases that I'm going to talk about, open source standards such as the Skills Framework for the Information Age, which is a global standard that's now available in over 200 100 countries. It's been around since 2000, and it actually provides 7 levels of measurement across IT capabilities, starting from that emerging careerist all the way through to the C-suite. And what that allows us to do is to be able to build those skill capabilities that are relevant to industry, map them against AQF as we do in Australia for industry accreditation of university degrees, but then be able to show the practical application within the workforce and to be able to put that against KPIs within the workforce to be able to show how that skill is being developed, and then award micro-credentials against them, which can be stacked. And because then you have the SOPHIA standard and you have the AQF mapping, you can actually pivot from within the workforce to then going into a master's program and getting that recognition of prior learning. That then means you're actually undertaking higher education study that is relevant and pertinent, rather than having to sit through stuff that you know just as well as the lecturer that's providing it. So we're starting to see this really innovative bridge that is built in order to be able to meet the learner's needs. But also validating framework levels means that we can put them against job families and job roles, and that industry can really help us build those standards and frameworks that we work towards. And I'll give you a couple of case studies in a moment as to how that's been worked really well across a number of different large corporations, but also some small to medium enterprises as well. The ability, again, that common language means that we have a validation criteria that we can use across individuals, teams, and the organisation. And when you're trying to measure the abilities, the skill gaps, and pertinent learning and development for your organisation, that becomes an incredibly powerful tool. It means HR, the learning and development part of the business, are all working together with the business owners as well as employees to better understand where individuals are sitting and how they can get to the next level of mastery, and the types of projects and internal work that can be offered in order to provide meaningful educational offerings, but again, that can be micro-credential badged and displayed as a proof of ability and enhanced ability that's happened. And again, universities are starting to get comfortable about accepting those into various different areas. At the moment, I'm seeing that happen a lot within the master's space, but it's also starting to happen within the school space as well, with those that are working outside and being able to prove capability and being able to enter into university degrees outside of a traditional ATAR, a raw score. It's all about the person themselves. So I mentioned meaningful recruitment processes. One of the things that's starting to happen is banks of questions that are put together against the various different levels of capability framework. So again, you're using the common language across the whole of the business. And then what is really happening is we're starting to see companies using capability frameworks to be able to provide a return of investment measure on their learning and development programs, seeing how the experientially based application is moving the business along as well as the individual career and skills capability. Thanks, Marco. So, I mentioned problem solving earlier. What are the types of frameworks that I've been involved in building? I've been very fortunate working with Deakin University, who's been in this space for quite some time, to build what we call now the employability skills. Those soft skills that we all know aren't soft. We now refer to them as employability skills. So areas of problem solving and financial acumen, that's becoming a huge one, as is innovation and adaptability post-COVID. Entrepreneurial mindset is becoming an increasingly important skill that companies want to be able to measure and to be able to determine how to build within a workforce. And then, of course, diversity and inclusion. And Kevin's already mentioned digital literacy at those higher levels, digital acumen. How can you actually transform the whole of business in terms of digital implementation and the ways in which you can upskill your workforce to ensure that you stay at the head of the game? Thanks, Marco. So when we look at a credentialing framework and we look at the ways in which we're going to build it, we need to be able to determine those assessment considerations. So, I've mentioned numerously, and we'll always continue to talk about the common language that we have within a capability framework, but also breaking the criteria of the skill levels. I build frameworks normally between 3, 5, and 7 levels of capability, depending on the maturity of the organisation. And so the learner has got to be able to understand what it is they can do at their particular level and how they can then increase to the next level, and what the micro-credential assessment will look like in order to be able to gain the digital badge with the metadata showing what it is that they've achieved. We're also now, in Josh Berson's flow of learning, the 4 E's of education, experience, exposure, and environment. You've got to be able to provide learners with the opportunity to be able to apply what it is they learn. Higher education is becoming incredibly good at making sure that there's problem-based, whether it's work integrated learning, internships, capstone projects, that recognition that there absolutely must be a way to be able to apply in order to be able to credential against capability. Reflection is an incredibly important part of the capability frameworks that I build. If you can't think about why you did what you did or how you do it differently, how you grew from the experience, then as a professional, you're not growing. So making sure that there is a way to be able to underpin any kind of assessment with a reflective practice is also incredibly important. Organisations are becoming incredibly aware of that and are really starting to include that within their learning and development practices. And then allowing exercises towards ensuring that the artefacts that you need to be able to produce in order to be able to prove capability, you can actually build them within the workplace. So that, again, we've got the synergy of education, lifelong learning, and work integrated learning happening on the job. Thanks, Margot. So all of that underpins the capability frameworks. And so I'm going to now talk through some of the use cases that I've been fortunate enough to work on. With one of the big 4 Australian banks, we were approached to build a whole of enterprise capability assessment framework. And that was so that it could be global, because particularly within the IT space, a lot of procurement is happening globally. And so what we were looking at was a way in which to measure how we could bring the whole of the business together, collapse job roles to make sure that they were at the same levels of mastery and that they were underpinned by the same kinds of skill capabilities. Interestingly, one of the areas that they wished to develop was a coaching framework, and that was to be able to ensure that mentoring and coaching was happening at every aspect of the business. And then the L&D section then subsequently built a capability framework, which was closely followed by a leadership framework. All of those feed into each other. And what we did was this bank had 186 competencies that they had built across, a 10, 15-year period, and that were conflicting in terms of ways of transparency and what was measurable and what was important. And so we were able to collapse those down to 18 capabilities and then build those at 4 different levels of mastery, so that there was a very clear expectation of what was required at each of those different levels. And now there is a library of learning and development that has been built against the criteria that underpins the capability frameworks, that is learning and development. And then after 6 months of application within the bank, you bring that back and you apply for a credential assessment at the particular level, and then you get awarded a badge if you're successful. The global agricultural company was a brilliant one. We started with Australia, locally, Australia and New Zealand, and built a capability assessment framework for 4 levels. Once we'd finished that, the head company in North America decided that what they would like to do is expand it to include both the executive teams across North America, South America, Europe. So it turned into an enterprise capability assessment that could be used across multiple jurisdictions. And so again, you can then start to see where that common language becomes incredibly powerful, because all of a sudden the learning and development is being met, the ways in which succession planning is being determined, and the common language that sits behind you're sitting here, this is what you need to learn in order to be able to get to the next level. And one of the capabilities that they developed was business transformation. Interestingly, the digital literacy and acumen they felt was something that needed to go across the whole of the business and not be called out as a capability, but rather embedded within each of the other core capabilities that were built. So that got peppered throughout the framework. That's now being used, it's in its first year, and we're getting great results in terms of learning and development and the succession planning that they are pulling together. On a slightly smaller scale, an Australian executive recruitment firm decided to build their own global leadership framework. And interestingly, because they place a lot of board members, they actually wanted to look at a higher level than even an AQF and master's level, which is the levels we've built with the other two organisations. And so here we started with the board and moved down through the C-suite, general managers, and sort of ended at a supervisory level. But what they were able to do from that is then build a skills diagnostic mapped to the criteria that they had built within their capability framework, and are able to micro-credential their candidates as proof of capability at various different areas, so that when they send them out, and they do a lot of executive search in the gig executives, so a gig exec to come in for 6 months to transform the business, or because the CEO is on maternity leave and they need to cover, or various different elements of why they bring a C-suite in. And so consequently, they were then being able to determine not only the discipline-specific skills, but also those of emotional intelligence, adaptability, agility. If it was a more conservative accounting firm, for example, they were then able to ensure that there was more of a perhaps not so innovative, somebody that could hold the ship steady. Whereas within an edutech company, then they'd want somebody who was very agile and very open to innovation. And then you can imagine the database that is now built of where people are sitting, the digital credentials, the micro credentials that they have, but also now they can turn into a learning and development company and start to show their executives where they're sitting and how they can progress to the next levels in various different capabilities, and then co-design with universities programs to actually upskill those executives. So we can start to see the nexus of industry and education really coming together to meet the needs of individuals, whether they're at the top of their game or if they're, middle management progressing. And then finally, the international supermarket retail and consumer services chain. This is a really interesting one. This is a true nexus between education and industry. So taking their own learning and development initiatives, mapping them into assessment criteria against the Australian qualifications framework, and being able to award credentials against those characteristics or skills that the incumbents already had, and then give them a third off a master's of an MBA, where they didn't have to sit what they already knew. And so consequently, for very busy senior product executives, they were able to carve a third off of their MBA, recognition for what it was that they achieved, but also work on real life problems within their business as their capstone within that degree. So again, you can see how it becomes really individualized, really meaningful, and that both university and industry are co-designing together relevant, informative education pathways. Thanks, Mark. I think I've got one more slide before I pass to you. So, that was really very Australia intense. I've been very lucky to also work in North America. Canada are doing some amazing initiatives. And the Ministry of Nova Scotia is working with high schools at the moment to provide micro-credentials and the ability to be able to stack micro-credentials into university degrees, and consequently skip a couple of units at the beginning of a degree because they already have the skills that are required. Aged care workforce is becoming incredibly relevant as well, particularly in terms of skilling overseas and then skilled migration or coming over to Australia for higher education study, but then actually being able to work meaningfully within skill gaps that are within Australia because they have undertaken offshore training and then it's been micro-credentialed and then they can utilize that within the workforce. And I'm pretty sure that digital wallets will come up at some stage and the ways in which you can then start to pack all of that information. So your micro-credentials, but as well as all of the extras that you can build to show your individual abilities. The last one I'm particularly proud of is the National Collaborative for Digital Equity. That is an initiative in New Hampshire, North America, and that is where low socioeconomic kids who come from third generation unemployed parents have been given financial literacy training. And as a result of that, they've been able to open their own bank accounts and get half credits towards a local community associate degree, thus starting them on the journey to being able to undertake education. So as well as a common language, I would also suggest that micro-credentials are incredibly empowering, both for individuals and also for those that recognise them in order to be able to help educate further. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Ashley. That's absolutely fascinating insight, incredible detail, and so rich. I think there are overlaps to what each of the three of us are going to say, but then it's where and how we're able to expand and develop that conversation laterally. So thank you. Margot's going to talk to us next, and then we're going to have the opportunity to have some conversation. Margot.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. That was amazing, Ashley, and also your talk too, Kevin. It's kind of the curse of going last, isn't it? So I'm going to try and bring all of this together. Let me first zoom out a little bit, and then I'm going to zoom right into skills and more specifically skills data. And so I'm going to start with talking about a lot of the things that Kevin and Ashley have spoken around as an emerging skills ecosystem. And I'm deliberately reinforcing the word skills. And as Ashley pointed out, capabilities are overarching, but they're made up of skills and knowledge and behaviors and cognitive abilities. Just know that I'm talking around, a generalist term. So we won't get into the nuances of definitions right here, right now. And I'm going to be calling them skills, but they're in and of the same family of what we've been talking about. And so the skills ecosystem is kind of newly emerging. And you can see here, this is a representation of some of the stakeholders within it. We've spoken of some, right? The education institutions, certainly the industry whom we're talking with today, the government and the policymakers who are, perhaps certainly in places like Australia, bringing down their quality frameworks and some of the standards to sort of, try and make sense of this new nascent ecosystem. And of course, most importantly, the individuals, the learners, right? And being able to empower the learners with agency around their learning and their learning data. So this is a Harvard Business School quote, which is really just talking around that, evaluating employees and new hires around skill sets rather than their work history, or I would say the degree as their proxy, really would help companies, as Ashley so eloquently pulled apart for us, helping them to have visibility on the talent that they already have, but also their talent acquisition and where to, fill the gaps and where they can upskill and reskill their current workforce for those jobs of the future, which we simply don't know what they are right here, right now. So I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about this skills ecosystem and the fact that it's all working together, right? It's not going to happen just in one place. It's going to happen with us all working together. When we talk about skills and therefore skills based micro-credentials, this was some stats from earlier on this year, but 81% of employers felt that organizations should hire based on skills rather than degrees. And that 74% of Gen Z, so 70% of those younger learners, they wanted to learn skills to prepare them for jobs that will be in demand in the future. So already we've got, a skills-based hiring agenda that's moving forward, that's going to require a skills-based learning agenda to be in place within our educational institutions. So, we've spoken a little bit around this notion of skills as the currency of the new labour market. And why is that? And I think it's around increasingly, the degree or the qualification is no longer the proxy for hiring. It's not that it's going to go away, absolutely not. But it's no longer that signal to employers that that's the only thing that's going to be the indication that employees or learners have these skills. It's generally felt that skills create a more transparent alignment between academic content and careers, and that they provide a new educational currency, really for better employment returns. It's felt that also skills create relevant career connections for learners. And actually, I think this is an important one, certainly for me, that it levels the playing field, right, for a more equitable access to opportunity. I think that's a really key thing that we're feeling, not just, locally for us here in Australia, but absolutely globally, that equitable access to opportunity. And I think for me, and I'm coming from a skills data perspective, that focus on skills level data allows for visibility across the ecosystem. And visibility is a big word for me, right? It's visibility for learners to understand and know their skills and competencies, to be able to communicate that in a hiring situation. For institutions, as Ashley indicated, to know that data, to understand where the skills and competencies lay for the employees. But also from, the intersection of all of that, how can we move this data? How can we make this skills data visible in across all the stakeholders? So it's kind of leading me to say, yes, we have to develop intentional strategies around our learning, whether that's in an educational institution around micro-credentials, certainly that's within an industry or corporate setting around, how you're architecting your learning. But the twin track of that is really to think around your digital architecture, because it's just as important, particularly in this digital age, that we can move the data as well as moving the people. And that any kind of information that we have has to be both human visible, human readable, but more importantly, machine readable. So we have to have your learning and skills data in a form that can move between systems and be understood by the machines. Ashley spoke around a common language. There's a common language, again, from the human perspective, but we also have to have a common machine language. That's equally as important. So I just want to stress, those twin tracks of strategy are going to be vital for any organization into the future. So why does industry need digital credentials? Well, as everyone has said, we're in the fourth industrial revolution. We are not going backwards. We are digital into the future, and that our learning has to be digitally recognized and represented, and that there are forms and standards for that to happen. I think that there is a strong equity issue, right? There has to be recognition of all learning, not just the formal learning that we spend a little bit of time speaking about here, but recognition of all forms of learning. All forms of learning count. There has to be a concept around mobility. That's social mobility. You know, can I have the opportunity to learn so I can make my situation better? And can I move myself between geographic locations? And can I move my data with me? So, you know, all of these notions around mobility are increasingly important. And this all does come back down to those notions of learner agency, empowering the learners with their data, but also the creation of visible career pathways. That word visible again, we really have to strive to do that. So these are the questions I would ask you around your learning and development strategy. Do you have visibility as an organisation of the skills and capabilities of your employees? And we heard from Ashley around, you know, ways and means and tools to do that. Do you understand where your gaps lie for upskilling and reskilling opportunities? Do you have a skills taxonomy for your business? Are you all speaking the same language around skills? And do you have a capability framework? If you don't, we have an expert in the room. Do your employees have visibility over their personal skills and capabilities? How are you going to scale your skills strategy, right? This is where your data architecture comes in. How are you going to scale it? How are you collecting the evidence of learning? Right? How are you making this accessible for learners in a human and machine readable way? And what does your skills data architecture look like? Like, how are you going to move this skills data to maximize the utility for learners? So this is a little diagram I prepared earlier. And this is, I guess, in conversation with a wonderful person who's doing great things in this field, Dr. Naomi Boyer from Education Design Lab. And in conversation with her, we kind of came up with these steps to technology enablement across the skills ecosystem. And the first place that you're going to start is identifying the skills. Ashley spoke long and hard around that. You know, this is human work in identifying these skills, right? It will be machine enabled, but it's human work right here, right now. And as we move through the rest of these steps, you'll see that the machines can take over. But right at the beginning of this journey, there's a lot of human work that does actually have to go into that. I'm going to deal with these steps as I go through, but if we're talking just at this step one, identifying skills, when it comes to data, there are data standards being developed. One of these, and it's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination, but one of these that my company in particular are looking very carefully at is a data schema so that we can pack as much information at the skill level as we possibly can. So when the machines try to read it, and when this is shared between systems, that it can be unpacked. And within a rich skill descriptor, there are all manner of metadata that you can put into that data schema so that people can understand what it means, what the value of that skill is. And if you like, it's a common language. So the skill statement, what that skill aligns to, you know, in Ashley, spent some time talking around the frameworks. What frameworks does it align to? And you can put that into the skill description. What's the occupational data? You know, what jobs does it relate to? Are there any standards or certifications that particular skill aligns to? So it's a mechanism, a data schema to be able to pack as much context as we can down at that really granular skill level. So we've got skills, we've identified them, you know, we may have actually compiled a library. But what the next step is around, you know, developing those frameworks. You know, can we develop and compile these skills into open digital skills frameworks? And there are existing data standards, that enable this. Again, this is going to be human work, but there's a lot of machine-enabled technology development happening out in the world at this particular step as well. So when we talk about compiling skills, again, this is an organisation that Ashley is absolutely involved in. This is Education Design Lab's competency framework. And you can see it also goes down to the sub-competency level. The thing I love about this one is the crosswalks, that, it's not just competencies in isolation. Those sub-competencies all connect in with each other. And this Metro map, does a lovely job of sort of showing that interconnectedness. One of the other ones, again, this has Dr. Ashley Jones' footprint all over it, is with the Digital Skills Organisation, and this is their digital literacy framework. So these are just examples. I just threw them up there to show that there's a number of them out there, but it's important to take your skills and build them into a framework. The next step is to actually make all those linkages, right? You can't just have them in isolation. I mentioned the word crosswalks. Those crosswalks are vital. You need to intentionally communicate the linkages. You need to understand what's learned, how it's assessed, and more importantly, what is the evidence and the proof. This can be machine enabled. There are mechanisms out there to enable this data to be packed into the digital recognition of learning. I'm going to show you unashamedly something that our company does, and this is an evidence record. So we take data, we compile a personal evidence record for the learner of their skills and competencies. And you can see here that we also do have links out to skill definitions. We link it out to the taxonomies. At this level too, we also link out to alignments and we link out to the artifacts. Ashley was talking about the importance of reflective practices and the compilation of, or allowing intentionally within the organisation, the ability to compile your evidence of learning as proof you can do what you say you can do. And then you need to then have a way to actually digitally represent that so that, again, the humans can read it in a hiring situation, but more importantly, the machines can read it so that you don't get screened out. I don't know how much of a problem this is in your world, but certainly in Australia and definitely in the US. And the statistics are escaping me right here, right now, but the amount of applicants being screened out through the applicant tracking systems because their skills do not align is actually staggering. So we need to do better. We need to do better in aligning the data so that that is not happening. Step 4, this is when you start to digitally document your achievement, right? So this is when you start to compile all of your achievements into a place that you can share. Again, Ashley mentioned digital wallets and the development of the standards, the data standards that are underpinning the development of digital wallets is going ahead in leaps and bounds. You may also hear them called comprehensive learner records. And in the employment world, you'll probably hear them called learner employment records. And there's a lot of work that's been happening from the T3 Innovation Network in the US through the US Chamber of Commerce that's looking very carefully at how those learner employment records are adopted and rolled out through the US. Sorry, I forgot I popped that little slide in there. This is the T3 site around LERs. And then when we go to the wallets and then to the resume of the future. So if we're able to actually digitally represent and recognize our skills at that base level, our skills, and then as they wrap up into bodies of learning like micro-credentials, we have to have a way to share that. We've got to be able to store it, we've got to be able to share it, and we've got to do it in a way that we have control over the data because we choose to share it as a learner with whom and whatever we want to share. And that's only going to be enabled through these digital wallets and the smart resume of the future. Work is happening in this area. I'm just showing you an example of a US organization called Smart Resume, who are part of a company called Identify. Identify. And they have an amazing product called Smart Resume. And there's a lot of workforce boards, state-based workforce boards in the US that are sort of trialing and piloting this kind of capability for their workers. So just coming to the end of my soapbox around data and data standards and having open data standards. These are my rules of engagement for developing digital credentials if you want to enable this true flow throughout an open data system, an open ecosystem. Firstly, intentional design for open data standards. You've got to promote trust, right? Micro-credentials are new. Digital badges are new. The way that traditional paper credentials have existed and been a transaction in the past has been around the trust of the issuing organization. That's not always there. So we have to have trust promoting activities through transparency of the data, right? That's going to be really important. You're going to have to design for sustainability and prevent that lock-in. You do not want to have vendor lock-in or proprietary lock-in of your data. You need to ensure that they're portable, right? There's portability, there's learner centricity, and there's longevity in whichever digital architecture design you go with. And to that point, you have to have interoperability to align with your existing infrastructure. You're not going to chuck everything out and start again. It's not feasible, not going to happen. You're going to have systems in place, which do great jobs, but you need them all to talk to each other. So that interoperability is going to be crucial. You have to provide accessibility. It's non-negotiable. You have to support different issuers and types of credentials. There's not going to be one type of credential that rules them all in this world. So you actually have to design and make it supportive of different issuers and different types of credentials. Otherwise, it's all going to fall apart. Most importantly, you've got to make it scalable and you've got to make it fault tolerant. So do your due diligence. And you must minimize for personally identifying information. Don't collect stuff you don't need. You don't need to do it. So absolutely minimize for your personally identifying information. I'm going to close there by saying there are a ton of groups working internationally on open linked data standards, not just in the US, but certainly in Europe and in other places. They're all coming from a common place, and that common place is openness, right? That to move into the future, we have to make data transparency and data interoperability a priority, whichever systems we design. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you, and I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Kevin.
Thank you very much, Margot. Again, just added so much more detail and depth, and I think between the three of us, we've produced a nice kind of continuity of that discussion, thinking about it from the educational through the higher education perspective, bringing it into some of those kind of framework considerations in that industry perspective, and then said, taking it right down into the real nitty-gritty of what does it look like in practice, what are the frameworks look like, and what are the tools and technologies you need to drive those conversations. And for me, more importantly, what is some of the thinking and some of the questions that you need to ask yourself that you put into the design of some of those tools and mechanisms. So Zaid, I think we will finish there and look forward to any comments, questions that might arise from your colleagues.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the insightful presentation. We have received several questions during the session from our audience. Given the time constraints, we'll try to cover as many as possible, if not all. The first question that we've received is, do you think there is a preference in the industry for micro-credentials?
I might defer to Ashley and Margot on that one, because obviously I come from with a real bias. Margot, maybe you actually touched on this a little bit yourself, and then I think Ashley's probably got a view on it.
I'll take a stab at it. This is very new. Like, what we're doing is very new. So therefore, the research, the statistics, and the evidence, the metrics, I don't think are there at the moment. However, there's been a little bit of research and study coming out of the US from an organization called SHRM, which is their Society for Human Resources. They've done several studies indicating what the preferences for hiring managers are within organizations. And those are both larger organizations, but also smaller organizations. And increasingly, they are turning to, if an applicant has alternative credentials, as they call them, we call them micro-credentials. If they have alternative credentials, and if they have other forms of learning, the preference for that is really increasing towards, degrees or formal qualifications. So there is some really interesting research coming out. The data is starting to come through, but it's still really early days, really, really early days. Ashley, if you could add to that.
Look, I agree with you totally, Margot. We are in such a nascent environment that there's a lot of work. We've moved from what to, or even why, to how. But in terms of the data supporting employer uptake, particularly in Australia, is very small. That said, the appetite and interest in micro-credentialing is growing daily. So we don't have the data showing how much is being taken into consideration, but certainly the appetite to build is huge.
So the only comment that I would add to that is that as an educator, and I again, cards on the table, I'm a university educator, the concern that I have a little bit, and it goes back to my original comment about is it degrees, micro-credentials, or both? The fear that I have is that we might be creating paradigms and narratives where already time-poor students, often from less traditional backgrounds, who struggle to properly engage with a formal qualification, suddenly find that employers are expecting them to not just have their Bachelor of X, but on top of that, they want to see that they've collected 6 to 10 micro-credentials that demonstrate that not only do they have their bachelor's degree, but they've achieved these additional skills. And of course, all of that, if we're not careful, just puts significant additional pressure onto students. And if you're not careful, you could create a world where the students who have best access to resources and the most time on their hands, who usually come from non-low socioeconomic environments, are the ones who are best set up to succeed. So I think we just, for me, there's a bit of a caveat around this where we just need to be really, really careful.
Great, thank you. The second question is, how do you see micro-credentials and formal qualifications complement each other?
Well, given I think I just touched on that a little bit, again, I might pass, maybe give Ashley the first crack at this one, because I think, Ashley, you probably do work very much in that intersection, that nexus, as you described it, between formal and less formal education.
Look, my glass is always half full, and I truly believe that micro-credentials are a positive disruptor.
Yeah.
And I say that with all of the caveats that Kevin's mentioned, but I do believe that it brings equity, and I do believe that it allows for measurement of skills that are already in existence, that actually works beautifully to be able to ensure that degrees remain relevant, but that we don't have students undertaking that which they don't need to because they're already masters of particular areas. And so I think from that perspective, they work beautifully together.
And I think, Zaid, it's one of the reasons that we sought to pull together a Queensland community of practice around micro-credentials was because we had this concern that if there weren't those of us who are involved in the formal education process looking to place some kind of frameworks or structures or almost rules in place that help to shape the conversation, that we would lose that positive. We could be very quickly moved away from that positive perspective that Ashley gives us into the much more kind of negative perspective that I painted, and the onus is on us as the professionals in this space to be making sure that we do frame the conversation and develop it in that way. Margot?
Yeah, I just like to say, I think we can't be thinking around black or white, right? It's not it's not an either or. It's together, because
both and
that's right. We're talking about recognition of learning at the end of the day. Now, that's whether that's recognition of existing learning, whether it's recognition of existing experience, whether that's recognition of formal learning. They're all part of the same continuum. And it's just a question of how and when you recognize that. And the fact that we have the ability now to do that in a digital way, you know, to ring fence the outcomes in a digital way, I don't think it negates the absolute importance of degrees. You know, I certainly do not want to drive over a bridge that's not built by a degree, you know, backed engineer. I don't. But having said that, I think the days are gone when institutions can hold hostage the learning for the 4 years that it takes to get the degree, right? Because life happens in the way. You know, and so if you're 2 years down a degree, why can't you be recognized for those 2 years worth of you know, blood, sweat and tears that you've put into that? Dip out if you need to, and then dip back in, right? So I do think that it's a question of recognition rather than either or, you know, the battle of degrees versus alternative credentials. That's not it. It's recognizing our learning when it happens, how it happens, and that empowers the learners to do what they need to do for their mobility. So
I'm just going to throw this out there, Margot, but when you're a young, comparatively young, emerging nation that is looking to build new structures and processes and mechanisms, it sounds to me that you nationally, we're talking here about, you know, Saudi Arabia and probably lots of other countries in a similar position. You're right to make sure it's this kind of thinking that informs those processes. You're not so held up or caught up in some of the old-fashioned ways of thinking that that we struggle to deal with.
again, I think our structures are important. They're really important to the scaffolding that we need around this is really important. The capability of frameworks that we build, you know, the quality assurance frameworks that we build are vitally important, but we shouldn't lose sight of why we're doing that. And we shouldn't let the regulations rule what needs to happen, I suppose. You know, they can't interfere with what needs to happen.
Zaid.
We've just received an interesting question, honestly. Do you agree that gaining certain skills related to program learning outcomes may not require 4 to 5 years learning as an undergraduate student? So there's a need to make learning duration more reasonable.
So I'll tell you what I think about that. And this is coming from someone who is an educator, and I've also been formally trained, as it happens, by the Australian Defence Force as a training developer. I think that education, the requirement to achieve a learning outcome, to learn a piece of knowledge or a skill, takes as long as it needs to take to achieve it. And because it suits us in our industrialized model to break learning up into units for a university perspective and align them with 150 hours of study, that's entirely notional, because my background is in competency-based education, and the reality is that, and this I think also fits in those paradigms of recognizing current competence or prior learning or the achievement of previous skills. I'm very drawn to the notion that it takes you as long to achieve the learning outcome as you need to achieve it, and two individuals seeking to achieve the same learning outcome, well, if you have three individuals, one might not need to achieve it at all because they have previously. And of the other two, one might take 5 hours to achieve that learning outcome, and the other person might take 50 hours. So that's really where I come from this. And if I was starting from scratch, I'm much more drawn to institutions like, I think it's Western Governors University in the US, that designs their award courses on that notion of achievement of competence. Not so easy to do when you're in a very traditional system that's predicated on semesters and terms, and what is essentially born out of an industrial context and an industrial age model. But again, Ashley and Margot will have their own views on this.
No, I think you're spot on. I think you're absolutely spot on. You know, in some ways, we've always thought about, in the same way that we think about degrees being 3 or 4 years and volumes of learning, you know, seniority in a role, you know, and whether or not you can go up to that next level because you've got 5 years experience. Well, 5 years experience to one person is completely different to 5 years of experience to somebody else. It's that individualized journey. So, you know, couldn't agree more that we actually need to move away from volumes of learning and to actually go to Margot's point of skills and ability to be able to prove that capability.
And just quickly, so much of that volume of learning, you know, has been an artificial construct that has come from funding, that they constructed that to control the money, not to recognize the learning, right? So, you know, I agree with what's being said. You know, I think there's a reset due. There's a reset due, not just in Australia, not just in the US. There's a reset due globally on how we think and recognize learning. So, and we need to relax a lot of those artificial constructs that have been placed upon us for way too many decades. In fact,
which is why the assessment is so essential, right? At the end of the day, it's the proof of the capability. And as long as you've got rigorous assessment to ensure that your engineer meets all of those structural requirements, then volume of learning.
Somebody asked a question in the Q&A, and I think the question was along the lines of how do we know that the person who's achieved the micro-credential is, how do we assure ourselves that they're capable of doing what the micro-credential says? But if I strip it all back and remove technology and everything else and go back to everything I understand about curriculum, it's essentially understanding, ensuring that you've described the capability, the competence appropriately, the process of then turning that into a series of learning outcomes by which you assure yourself that if this person achieves those 4 learning outcomes, they will be capable of delivering this, whatever it is. And then making sure that you design your assessment so that it's constructively aligned to those learning outcomes. And then if the assessment is appropriately measuring the achievement of the learning outcome, and it's well designed and quality assured, then you don't need another test, because the assessment itself is the test of the demonstration of the fact that you've achieved that capability. In fact, I'd even go so far to say is if you're retesting those people who've achieved micro-credentials because you don't believe that the assessment in the micro-credential is giving you that confidence, then you probably want to have a very hard look at your micro-credential in the first place. A good question, Zed, a really good question. And I think at essence, it goes down to the appetite to seriously, this is almost playing into Clayton Christensen's notions of disruption and disruption of means of production. And I think that higher education is currently being disrupted, and it might just be that we are forced to think about new models, i.e. competency-based Western governance type approaches, where we have to design degrees that are much more self-paced, that enable learners to move through them in the time frames that suit them. But then you have to work out how you achieve that in a massified, industrialized system, where we also build in this notion of the importance of collaboration and engagement, because very often that self-paced journey is a more lonely one. You can do it both ways. It's just requires very careful consideration and design. Great question.
Thank you. Do you have an example of an academic institution in your region that recognizes an industry-developed micro-credential for credit? If yes, what were the perceptions of the stakeholders?
Over to you, Ashley.
Yes, so look, when I mentioned the mini MBA that's currently undertaken, there are now several of those. Deakin University is undertaking them, and I know that there are a number of other universities around Australia. Arizona State is working quite comprehensively in this area. Vendor certificates are starting to become currency that are being accepted into universities. So it is a real recognition that as long as industries endorse, I mean, this is where I think the rub is now starting to happen. It's that industry is starting to take the lead on determining what they want and what is relevant. And so consequently, that positive disruption that Kevin was talking about is starting to happen. And there really are some very serious examples of how this is working really well. Deakin University now has 700 candidates going through from a corporate organisation that micro-credentialing is the bridge to take them into those MBAs.
Anything to add to that, Professor Ashford-Rowe?
I don't know. I mean, I know Ashley's very familiar with Deakin. I believe RMIT has Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, another university in Melbourne, has done an awful lot of work on their micro-credentials and connections through industry. But no, I think that Deakin example would be the first place that I would go and look to see what does that look like and how has it been done.
And
but
Griffith,
there will be
your back garden as well, Kevin.
Yeah, Griffith, do it. Internationally, I mean, Ashley mentioned the vendor certificates. So Google, Microsoft, AWS, Amazon, though their certificates, certifications are increasingly being recognized for credit in places like Northeastern University in the US. I know the University of Huddersfield in the UK. You know, I know that there is one in Australia, and to be honest, I just can't remember what it is. I'm terribly sorry about that. But yeah, so their industry certifications are being included into and have credit bearing recognition. So it's happening globally.
Why do you think it is important to adopt a common skills framework, both by academia and industry?
Well, look, for me personally, I look at education from the perspective of the student. I take a student-centered perspective, a learner-centered perspective, and in the middle of this educational stroke training ecosystem sits an individual who has to move on a journey from a school, maybe through various education, maybe through some work experience while they're undertaking their education, into an employment space. And if we can't provide consistent nomenclatures and consistent terminologies, the onus is on us to get our act together so we can enable them to move seamlessly through their lifelong learning journey, not to have to relearn and re-speak a new language every time they come up against a new organization or a new sector or a new business. That's why I think it's important.
I'd also add that we don't want a Wild West, and that we need to underpin everything we do with an assurity of quality, compliance, and to Kevin's point, ensuring that our learners have an absolute transparency of understanding of what it is they're undertaking and the value of it within the educational landscape.
Yeah.
And I'll just add that it's a language. It's a common language. It's a shared understanding for everyone to know what that baseline is and what the next level will be and what the next level will be, right? It's a comfort level too, right? What we need to be able to do is not put in artificial barriers to stop people from, moving forward, moving up, moving sideways, right? So it's a common language, and it's a common language, as I've said before. And if we don't speak the common language, like some of us here don't speak the same language, but we have a translation piece, and those frameworks are the translation piece. So they're really important in this emerging world, that we have that scaffolding in place.
I'll conclude with this question. Do you see a centralized ecosystem that embeds skills and micro-credentials would help fill the gap between the industry and academia?
I think it would go a long way towards it. I mean, Ashley used the compliance phrase, and I think that for me, it's not. I mean, I know that she didn't mean compliance in this sense. For me, it's not about forcing people to adhere to a particular standard, but describing a rigorous, informed standards framework that enables institutions to be able to comply, if you want, or adhere to that standard, so that you're giving students, learners, assurances that as they move through the various components of it, that the effort that they put into one place will be recognized, credentialed, and acknowledged somewhere else. And I think that's really what we're all trying to achieve here, is making sure that your effort is, well, as I said, is acknowledged and communicable.
And just for me, again, I'll probably say it again, and I'm sorry for repeating myself, but skills and capabilities are the grain size we need to go down to enable people to be able to talk to each other, right? Skills and capabilities are not necessarily the language of education, certainly not the language of formal education. And there's certainly, coming out of formal education and not being able to speak the language of industry is a barrier. So we need to really bring it down to this common and shared understanding, so that movement is enabled. And I keep on coming back to that metaphor, but you've really got to break it down to the smaller size. And I think skills and competencies are that grain size that is needed to then build it back up into other structures.
Look, I agree with both of my colleagues here. The fact of the matter is that in order for higher education to remain relevant, there has to be an understanding of what industry requires. We are in a fast-paced environment that is only going to get faster. Unless the two work together, we're going to be underskilled. And so, you know, to your point about the granularity of skills and capabilities, it's what is the next element? What comes after that? Who knows? But at the moment, this is what we need to work on.
Thank you so much for those great answers. A link to the webinar survey has been provided in the chat. We kindly ask the participants to complete it within 10 minutes after the end of the session. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center, we thank our distinguished host, Professor Kevin Ashford-Rowe, for leading this interactive and informative webinar on stackable micro-credentials and industry perspective. We also like to thank the esteemed panelists, Dr. Ashley Jones and Ms. Margot Griffith, for their valuable input, and of course, the participants for attending this webinar. Until next time, I'm Zaid Al-Ghaib. Thank you for joining us.